Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's a lovely sunny morning. There was a spectacular sunrise today, well, at least where I live, if anyone was up to see it. I was looking for foxes in my backyard, if I'm honest, but I didn't see foxes, but I did get a spectacular sunrise. So that was very pleasing to me. Um, we today have a very distinguished guest. And in fact, this is James Freeman. I imagine a lot of you know him, and he was supposed to be our very first speaker in this series as it was originally conceived. And then, a few like hiccups got in the way of everything. So, belatedly, I want to say, we are having James talk today. James, again, for those of you who don't know him, is both our faculty education director. He's also a lecturer of digital humanities, and he is a modern British historian, which we will see all kinds of these things come out, or at least the latter two, in his talk today called The Rhetorical Lives and Afterlives of Political Promises, which I think is a very a topic that is close to many of our hearts. So I think without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to James, ask everyone to mute their mics and let him begin.
Well, thanks very much, Karen. And I'm really grateful that 23 of you have got up at 9 a.m. on a Friday morning to come and listen to me talk about what fundamentally is a bit of a side project. But as all things, side projects can become significantly larger and more interesting than you first thought. And probably it's one as well that I've spent too much time on. So I might reflect, it might be some lessons for people's dissertation projects and others, the art students, as we go through. But yes, I think Karen's right that this does reflect kind of two sides of my my interests. So I'm primarily a political historian, and equally, I would say these days, I'm interested in digital methods, particularly how we can study and understand political culture at scale. So I won't say too much about what's on the screen at the moment because it will become apparent by the end of the presentation, I hope. And I should say these are new slides. These are new versions of the slides. So there may be a few typos in here. So we'll just have to catch them as they come. So the problem then, well, the problem when we think about political promises and how they've been analysed by scholars, in my view, is that we've spent a lot of time talking about the birth of promises and a lot of time talking about the judgment or the afterlife and the death of promises, I guess, the moment at which they're judged to have been met or not met. And in particular, in political science scholarship and historical scholarship, birth has really been about the process of why we create certain promises. So why politicians make certain promises. And normally with the kind of, yes, there's a lot of detailed kind of policy histories as to famous promises that were made through 20th century British politics and American politics. But in the background of all of that literature is normally this question of what does the making of that promise tell you about a party's ideology? So there are all kinds of studies of manifestos that look at promises and then try and match that party up on a left-right spectrum and use those promises to position it at a particular point in time. On the judgment side of things, fundamentally, political scientists often use kind of a roster of promises or a checklist, I guess, as to how many have been kept, and that's said to be a kind of measure of success of a party or a politician. But I guess a little bit deeper behind those questions is one about how healthy or otherwise is our democracy. Now, for me, the reason that's a problem is it doesn't tell us very much about what happens to promises in between or after that judgment process. So particularly in between their moment of birth and that moment of judgment, their actual life as a living political entity or a piece of political rhetoric, we know much less about that. And we know much less about how dead promises, if you like, live on in politicians' rhetoric. So after that moment of when it's been determined to have been kept or not, what kind of happens to them? And so for me, that asks some kind of basic questions that we surprisingly don't know the answer to. And we have kind of intuitions about some of these, but they're not ones that we've in the literature have tested very well. And they're quite difficult things to test. So basic questions about how frequently politicians make political promises, and when. So is our intuition right that the discussion of promises might happen more in pre-election periods, or maybe just after? You might have some thoughts about why may not that be, but we don't know. There are some interesting studies of elections that highlight the promises, but they don't compare it to the non-election period. All those studies are always focused around a kind of run up to an election and people creating a manifesto. So what do promises' lives look like in between and outside the periods of elections? We don't know very much about what function they actually play in democratic debate. We've got a good idea of this kind of met, not met expression of ideology on the other side of it, in the birth side. But what do they actually do for democratic debate? Why are they important? How do they actually mediate political discourse and the conversations we have? What do they offer politicians? Why do they make promises? And related to that is the problem that we know almost nothing about the rhetorical structures of promises. And what I mean by that is, what arguments and rhetorical appeals help politicians make promises? So what kinds of rhetoric do they use to make promises? And what, equally flipping that on its head, what do promises contribute in terms of to bigger arguments? How do promises fit in with the bigger arguments politicians are making? Are they a form of evidence, or are they a conclusion, etc.? And what types of promises are there, I guess, is a more basic version of that. So there are some interesting questions, and this is the argument I'm going to make to you this morning, which is that promises are a lot more complex. And that's the most basic claim I'm going to make, that the classic promise, as you might imagine it, spend more on the NHS, cut military spending, whatever it is just really one member of a much, much bigger family of arguments that I think we should probably think about as commitment rhetoric. So a standard political promise is not all that's out there in terms of how you make commitments in political speech. The second claim is that there's some structure and regularity to how promises are made, that this isn't random. There aren't infinite ways to make a political promise or put them into a political speech. There is, when you look at it at scale, structure and a predictable way in which politicians behave, and these arguments are made. And the third argument I want to make is that rhetorical act of making a commitment, and sometimes related rhetorical acts of shaming, commitment shaming, saying you haven't met this commitment, are much more important than just selling a policy or selling an ideology. Instead, they're one of a very few kinds of rhetorical acts that you can do in speech. So something you can actually do to your audience in a speech, which bind our political discourse together. And I'll say a bit more what I mean by that towards the end. So I'm a fairly greedy type of person. So when I started thinking about this project, which initially was for a chapter on a brief was to write something on political promises, I wondered how far we could push it and how much we could know. So in particular, I thought, what if we could know not just about the promises, not just some of them made, but what about thousands? How could we know about thousands of promises? Could we see promise rhetoric changing over time? So I'm a historian, so not just in the current 3 past years, but how could we look back over time and know lots about the speakers using it, the different contexts, and try and make infer some links between context and the types of promise behavior we see? Third, could we go back in time and recover those promises that have been deleted or lost? Are there ways to get back? And I'll say why that's important in a moment. The fourth, slightly more ambitious point was, could we do all of that automatically? Because I'm also lazy as well as being greedy. So I'd prefer a way of doing all of this automatically, where we can use digital technologies to sweep all of those promises up, automatically extract out for us what's the speech, what's the speaker, etc., etc. And then fifth, the one that I guess has become the center of the research. Is it possible to teach a computer to identify a promise or a commitment without giving it any rules, explicit rules to follow? So without defining it, but just showing it examples, is it possible to teach a computer to identify what a commitment is? So that was the challenge, and there's a reason the book chapter was more than 6 months late, because I probably bit off more than I could chew. But in the end, I did get there, and it's been, since my PhD at least, one of the most interesting and fun projects that I've done. So where's the point? Where's the right place to start in telling how we go about this? Well, the first thing you need to know is a bit about online politics in the 2000s, which is broadly when I wanted to write about, from about 1999 through to about 2015, so the end of the kind of collapse of the coalition government around that period. Now, what you need to know is that online politics in the 2000s was, I think, a golden age in terms of transparency in politics. The websites of political parties today are heavily edited, so that press and other organizations have very limited access to what politicians have said in the past. So the current Conservative Party's website and Labour websites only take you back to about 2014 in terms of their archive of material. Most of them have a moving wall, which we'll talk about again, which means that every year you lose part of that, and typically with every leadership change you lose part of that. So the classic example of this is that when David Cameron entered power with the coalition government, it was in the press at the time and reported that they had deleted all of the speeches that were made in opposition, because they were worried about people looking back and finding what they'd promised. Now, it wasn't quite true, in that they had worked with the British Library to take kind of archive screenshots of their archive versions of their websites and host them online, and they had a nice link there. So it wasn't entirely an act of censorship. It doesn't help that the British Library since have made those inaccessible because of copyright laws. So you've had a restriction where you have to now be linked up to a computer in the British Library to be able to see them. A more interesting case of this is when Gordon Brown took over from Tony Blair. Gordon Brown was very keen to rip apart the Blairist website that you see in the background here. And in doing so, whilst many of the speeches remained on servers in the background, they became inaccessible because the entirety of the menus were switched, all of the kind of Tony Blair speech archives were removed. So these things are fragmentary, and actually it's one of those cases in history where we've lost information the nearer we get to the present day compared to the birth of the web. So that's the context, and that was my main source, is speeches that were published, and parties were really, really good at this. Minor characters in parties were having their speeches published because at the same time you had a big centralization of party infrastructure that meant you couldn't really say anything without permissions process from Alistair Campbell. So they knew what was being said in press releases, and they collated it all together and they published lots of it. The problem we have is that these websites survive in varying forms. So on the left here is the 1997 version of the Labour Party website as it survives now, which was pretty basic at the time, but is even more now because we didn't capture the images. And on the right here is this is an example of what one of the speech pages looks like. These websites are really fascinating. You can they're kind of strange pre-smartphone, basically, in that they look very much more like newspapers in terms of their layout. You can have lots of little interactive things where you can create your own custom promises, where you put in your postcode and you get a kind of manifesto specific to you. So there's lots of interesting things there. How on earth do we recover all of that then? This is where it gets a bit techie. So I'm going to do this at a fairly high level, but try and give you an intuitive understanding of what you actually need to make this happen. So there are 3 types of program that are used to recover that material. One of the most basic is a web crawler, and it's a bit like how Google works. So it's a program that follows links on the web, reads a web page, finds a link, moves and jumps onto the next one and does the same thing. And what I did was build a web crawler that searches political parties' websites for links to speeches, and then moves on and follows and finds the next link to a speech. Doesn't read the speech at this stage, just gathers as many links to speeches as it can. Now, the problem is that many of the navigation systems are broken, right? So all of the Flash menus and JavaScript menus and drop downs, they don't work. So you can't do this manually. You have to do it behind the scenes, following things through. The biggest challenge is that these sites have what's called a moving wall, where every month they delete the previously, 3 months beforehand, they delete that last month. So you're constantly losing data. And so what we have to use is a time shifter, which uses kind of archived data on the web to turn back time on that website to different points, back and forth, until you can find a working link that was captured when a crawler, not my crawler, a Google web crawler or similar, last went through that site. So you have to manipulate the time to be able to recover a fuller list of links. So eventually what that came up with was a huge roster of what should be there in terms of links, what speeches we might be able to access. And then the last, I'll just nip out the way here, is a scraper. And what a web scraper does is effectively go in and read those web pages, tries to access the links that will work, tries a couple of variations to have a best attempt at it, and then rips out of that web page the speech text. And how you do that is a bit complicated, because you have to have, it's quite a challenge to teach a computer to understand where the speech is in a page of text. But thankfully, old HTML, if you've ever customized a bit of HTML, is structured. You can find that it has like paragraph tags that are always the same on the speeches. You can use the old web structure to kind of be able to identify the speaker, the speech, etc. So I'll show you briefly. This is just some of the code. All of that is just to get the speaker's name right. So we try a load of different methods just to try and get the right speakers, know who the speaker is in the speech. So what does that result in? Well, that resulted in a corpus, just a collection of speeches, of 5,603 speeches, about 8 million words, and with 501 different speakers. And there's a breakdown on the screen there of the coverage by the parties. So it's a bit variable. There are some quirks in this, and that Labour tended to release, there are more in the corpus, but they tended to be shorter, and that's because they had a less fine distinction between press releases and reports of speeches versus the full text. Conservatives, very good archive. Liberal Democrats, really, really messy. It took a little work to get there, but there's an interesting, there's enough here to do analysis at scale. So what's the simplest possible analysis we could do them with that data? If we have loads of speeches, millions of words, what could we have a look at? Well, the first thing that you can do with data like that is the simple analysis of how often do the words or terms that you might associate with promises occur. So I've put this as a promise term frequency chart, because it's not just searching for the word promise, it's searching for all the variations of that and synonyms for that. And what you'll see is that there's a cycle, and within that cycle, there are peaks and troughs. So the first cycle to point out to you, it's probably easiest to look at the red line. The red line is the percentage line, and the blue columns behind it are the kind of raw frequency. So the raw number of counts in that month. And what you'll see is that in broad terms, what you get is spikes before elections. So this is general election 2001, and you get a peak. There's a similar occurrence in 2005 here. And in 2010, it looks a bit different. You can see in terms of raw numbers, if you, depending on how big your screen is, I guess, you better see there is a spike in terms of raw numbers. It's less in terms of percentage. And that's just because there was a lot more speech published in that period for that election. And you can see that it's a bit distorted, because when there's much fewer speeches published in the months after that, more of them happen to be contain promises. So general election 2010 a bit less clearer, but there is a cycle across. Within that, you'll see it's bumpy. And the reason it's bumpy is that there's an annual cycle as well of promise making that centers on two key points, one in the spring around parties' local conferences, and one in the autumn around their party conferences. So this is all fairly intuitive. You should be able to, if you think as a political historian enough about that, that's probably what you'd come up with. But it's interesting that out of millions of words, you can detect that signal and that rhythm just via searching word frequencies. And in data science, that is a good sign that you're onto something, that you don't have to work the data too hard to see through the noise to something that would make sense to you. Now, the problem with frequencies and word counting of all kinds is that they don't take you very far. So I've put a quote here. It's probably the only time in my life I'll quote Michael Howard, I hope. But Michael Howard, 2005, his Conservative Party leader, an ex-Home Secretary. Interesting interview, I think, with Jeremy Paxman, if you want to YouTube that. But anyway, Michael Howard, this is a line that says, "No meddling bureaucracies, no ifs, no buts, no nonsense." Now that is a promise, that is a commitment, but it doesn't contain any of the traditional triggers, if you like, for identifying a promise. It doesn't say "we will." It doesn't say "I promise," the Conservatives promise. So how on earth are we going to identify these from text if we can't just come up with search terms that would work for it? And that's the point of why we use some more interesting techniques that get around this problem. So the first approach is the manual approach. And this is the thing that takes a lot of time, and a lot of I suspect at the time, if this hadn't paid off into a publication, I probably wouldn't be speaking about this as fondly as I am now. But the task I set myself was to analyze a random sample of 100 speeches from each party manually. And that turned out to be, splitting that into lines of a speech rather than just words, about 26,000 lines that I analysed to see if they contained a commitment. Now, if we take just those that we can be most confident about, that you'd agree with me that they were a commitment, i.e. a first party actor, so a first person making a promise, because sometimes people make promises on behalf of others and they're still political promises, such as, the NHS will do this, isn't a promise on that politician's part. But if we just take the ones we're most certain about, politician X promising you Y, around 5% of lines, or about 1 in 20, are promises, which is interesting, much higher than I thought it would be. From a randomized sample, about 1 in 20, so 1,285 were commitments made in that way. And then a smaller number of commitments, lines reflected past commitments, so things the speaker was referring to that they'd promised in the past. Or another number of lines, 88 lines of those were discussing their opponent's current promises, and slightly more were discussing their opponent's past promises. And that is something you see elsewhere in the data, that people talk just a bit more about what their opponents previously promised than what their opponents are promising now, but not by much. So that gives you a sense. About 1 in 20 lines in political speech are probably a commitment on the basis of this sampling. Now, what that enabled us to do, this is the tagging software I built to make this easier. But so you can go through and tag a promise and identify in a speech, and it throws out some nice data. What this allows me to do is to give you a brief guide to political promises. So I'll work through some of these and not all of them, just for the sake of time, but we can come and discuss them back. So it's almost like a user guide based on what politicians do rather than what we think they do with promises. So one of the things they do with their rhetoric is build an ethos. They build a character for that politician, a way of you accepting their arguments because you think things about them. So the chief one of these is they use promises to make them credible. So I promise you this, I will take no risks with British security. That's a David Cameron line. What on earth does that mean as a promise? It doesn't have it's not concrete enough to be a policy. What it is using a promise structure to kind of convince you that this person is trustworthy or is a leader. So it's nothing to do with a traditional policy promise. It's to do with building up a rhetorical image of what David Cameron's leadership is about. The other way to do this is to use promises as proof. So you've got this as old Gideon Osborne. Trust me, our Conservative business secretary can't wait to unleash hell on red tape. That's his claim, his ethos claim, that they're an anti-red tape party. And then how he backs that up in this speech is a list of promises that are about cutting red tape. So here the promise is serving not for its own sake, it's to back up a bigger claim, it's to provide proof. The other version of this is the anti-pledge. So Nick Clegg, perhaps ironically, developed an anti-pledge style. So he made really explicit commitments, but he coupled those with an ethos, a personality of being a skeptic about irresponsible promises and unrealistic pledges. And sometimes he'd read out a list of promises and actually end with, this isn't a promise, it's a plan. So the idea that you use promises, but then you combine it with kind of, oh, but I'm skeptical about other people's, I'm only promising you things I'm going to deliver. So it's much more complex than you might think. The second of these is dirty tricks. So ethos, dirty tricks. Well, there's lots of ways you can do this. Very obvious ways of saying people have broken their promises, therefore they're a failure. That's classic kind of William Hague versus Tony Blair style in the 2000s. There was lots of this. Blair promised you everything, failure to deliver. You can use it to point out contradictions. So you can say, like Chris Huhne is a Liberal Democrat attacking the Conservatives over liberalism. So if the Conservatives are really against the surveillance state, why do they promise to remove current checks on police surveillance? You can attack other people's promises in order to show contradiction with what they claim elsewhere. My favorite is perhaps the most mischievous, which is redescription, which is when you, as a politician, turn things on their head by describing unpopular policies as what your opponent is promising. So the classic example of this is Conservative speakers used to accuse Gordon Brown of promising to raise taxes, which really got on his nerve. Red-faced, very angry about doing that. But he also used it, and he encouraged electors to think of the Conservatives' pledge card, to sack nurses, to sack doctors, to axe schools, to remove the child and pensioner credits. So using the language of promises and turning on its head by saying that your opponents are promising to do something that's incredibly unpopular is a neat trick. I won't go through all of the pathos ones, but promises are also about setting the emotional tone for your audience. So there's something called a news high, which is people like to hear new things. They like to hear the latest news. And so quite often what politicians will do in their speech is to create positivity. They'll kind of trail, I'm going to make a promise at the end of this speech. All right. You then they have you hanging on the edge of your seat through the speech, and at the end you get the promise. And that rhetorically is very satisfying for a party audience. The other one I want to highlight from this page really is about confidence building. So quite often the challenge of being in opposition is that you can't do anything. So you have to persuade people that when you're in power, you really will do something. If I move my head out the way, this way, basically the Liberal Democrats used to do this a lot by ending their speeches with, we can, we will, which is a promise, right? And it is an emphatic line, and that was the applause line through lots of Nick Clegg speeches in the 2000s. Arrangement. So part of rhetoric is also about how you put speeches together, how you structure them. It's not just about what you say, it's about the order in which you say and how you build a speech that feels right and logical to an audience. And with promises, they play a really interesting role in that structuring. And you might argue, and it would be, I think my overall argument in some ways would be that promises aren't just fitting into existing traditional structures of a speech, that actually politicians increasingly built speeches around promises. So if I just give you two examples from here, I think are the most interesting. Probably the most typical structure is a promise block speech, and that's the one second across. And typically what this is you have an introduction, you then have a series of sections which are made up of a headline commitment, so something big, like we will reform the NHS, whatever it is, reform the police service. You then have a narration, which is a very traditional part of a speech where the politician tells you a story as to what's happened, and you have some arguments in there about why we should do things differently. And then the block ends with a series of kind of sub-promises, and then repeat on another subject. And you'll see that is a common structure, and the last slide will show you why I think that has become very important. Another nice one is puzzle solution. This is a very satisfactory thing as an audience to hear. So you have a long narration at the beginning of the speech that tells you a story, often begins with a joke, but then goes into a story as to what the problem is with society or what's still to be done if you're the person in government. There's then a hinge moment in the speech where somebody articulates their values. Tony Blair loved doing this. So you have a real long list of what had to be done, what had been done, what had to still be done. New Labour's values are this, And then linked to that, you get a series of commitments coming out of it. So the entire speech is building up to a moment of making commitments to the audience. So arrangement is really interesting. Now, that's from a manual analysis of the speeches, and I'd always say that you should combine whatever you do at scale with something that actually analyzes and understands the data in a lot of detail in qualitative terms. But the problem is, how can I make those claims about structure confidently on a sample of 300 speeches? Although random, so you'd expect it to extrapolate up, it's not going to give you that sense of how this works at scale. And we still would have the problem of what I think a speech, a commitment is, and how to define that in terms of keywords would be really, really tricky. It's not going to get you very far, and you're going to be massively biased towards obvious promises as opposed to less obvious ones. And so one of the areas I'm interested in methodologically is something called deep learning, which is the type of artificial intelligence and AI that drives cars. So effectively, what deep learning and machine learning in particular and neural networks are, which is really fundamentally, there are ways of computers learning by example. So they don't require any explicit rules. It's not like you have a huge series of steps, which you say, if this, do this. It's not like that. It's you show loads of examples in a training set where you give the computer the answer. And it implicitly, through iterating over and over and trying to get better and better at guessing, learns what the actual underlying rules are by just going through those examples, making bad guesses, marking itself against its guesses, and then going back and revising its approach to how it interpreted that data. So this is what I attempted, which was using that manual training data, that manual tag data. I basically took a random list of lines, which were either promises or not promises in my data set, and assigned them one of three roles. So there was some training data on which the computer would do its learning. So it would know the answers for these, not promise, promise. So you have a line and then we'd read the line and go, oh, this is a promise, this isn't a promise. You have some validation data where the computer kind of comes up with its rules, its own kind of way of approaching it, and it tests itself on some data it doesn't know the answer to. And then we see how good it is. We see how many answers it's got correct based on that. So it doesn't know the answer to these. And you adjust your model and you change the parameters, the amount of data you feed in, etc. But the critical thing is you then have a final lot of test data when you've said, this is it, we've got our model, we've taught this is the algorithm we're going to use for the computer to process this stuff. You have a test data which you know the answer to, but the computer has never seen before, and you test it and you have one go at it where the computer is able to apply its algorithm and see how many it gets right. And after a lot of work with this, we got to a model, or I got to a model that achieves 81% accuracy in finding out whether something is a commitment line or not. So if you show this algorithm 500 random examples, half of which are promises, and I don't just mean obvious promises, I mean difficult ones to pick up, and half of which were not promises, it guesses 405 correctly, right? So this is not great. We've still got a 20% error rate, but it's a lot better than it could be. It's a lot better than just random chance. And it has some big advantages over keywords because you can set kind of you can ask the computer what's the probability that this is a promise, and then set a cutoff threshold. So you don't just have to be a binary, this is a promise or not a promise anymore. You can say, actually, yeah, I'm only going to look at things that the computer is 70% sure is a promise. So as an example, despite including the keywords we will, which you might think would imply a promise, the following sentence, we will need to find out what could be done to build more housing, which isn't really a commitment. The computer would only rate that at 35% likelihood of being a promise. So we could set it to discard that easily. But it assigns increasingly higher scores to more promise-like sentences. So something like, we will find out what we could do to build more housing is slightly more of a commitment, right? Because they're saying, we will go and do something. And rightly, the computer then, I think in this case, if I move my head, 73%. So you can have a more gradation to what you pick out. Now, what's useful about that? Well, if we apply that, we can study that whole corpus over time. So studying that through these techniques, about 13,000 promise lines were more than 70% sure as being promises. And what's reassuring for me is if you look at the graph in front of you charted, they share broadly the same pattern over time. The election cycle pattern appears in this rhetoric. So here we're able to identify commitment-led lines, lines that we think are commitments on our model. And the history of it matches, reassuringly, what we would expect from our keyword lines. And there's a lot more lines in here than just things that mention promises in. So I think we can be confident that we're kind of seeing a real phenomena. Now, this is useful because we can look at it at scale, and don't worry that you won't be able to see anything on the screen right now. What this enables us to do is to look at the entire corpus in one go and see, make a kind of map, if you like, of where every promise made in our corpus between 2000 and 2013 sits within speeches. And if I just flip sharing my screen over, I'm just about to wrap up, so I've got time for questions. I will just show you this in a bit more detail. 1 second. Let's get that back. Right. So you should see a different screen now. Can you nod, Karen, if you can see this? So as I zoom in, this is what this promise map looks like. And I hope the contrast is just about high enough in some places for you to be able to see it. So what this image is every slice horizontally across is a speech divided up into 100 sections. And each of those sections is given a color depending on how many commitments are in it. So brighter colors mean there are more commitments identified in that part of the speech. And as we go down, all of these speeches are layered onto each other. So if you think about it, horizontally across is in time during a speech, where in the speech a promise is occurring or a commitment's occurring. And then vertically down, starting at the top is the year 1999. And then in chronological order, all the way down here is every speech in our corpus. And all I'd like to pick up as the final kind of points here is to notice a couple of things. There are a lot. And as I go down, there's constantly a lot. But what you'll see within this is that there is a structure. There are some speeches that looking across have lines that are promises that are isolated, commitments that don't really have anything else around them. They have large areas of black where there's just narration. There are others, if I find some near the top, where it's a lot more busy. This is an election here. And you'll see that there are periods of promising commitment, and then a couple of blanks, and then a more intense period of commitment. And when you look at these compared to the structures I was describing, you can find those structures in the structures, the arrangement structures I was talking about, those kind of problem solution structures. You can find them at scale in how people promise. So I'll give you a final example. If you look right the way down at the bottom of this, you'll see that there is the 2010 elections here. Some of these are ridiculously heavy promise speeches where literally it's promise, explanation, promise, explanation, promise, explanation. And those, when you go in and identify what speeches they are the speeches on the campaign trail. They're the manifesto launches. So I think what's interesting about looking at this data at such scale is that you can kind of begin to match up the things that we see in patterns in the original texts. You can match up and see with what you, I'll go back to the presentation. You can match those up with what you see at the data at scale. And that's, as a historian, is a very reassuring, way of looking at things. So in some conclusions then, what I would say is that promises are a lot more diverse. They show a lot more interesting functionality for politicians in their speech. And there is underneath it all, it's not random. There is a structure to how politicians deploy commitment rhetoric in their speeches. So I think I'll leave it there if it's all right in terms of content, Karen. And we've probably still got some time for some questions. I went on about 5-10 minutes more than I thought. So cheers.
Thanks, James. That was super interesting and also just very different for me, right? It was just something, it's a way I don't normally wrap my head around the idea of a promise, looking at big data in that way. So fascinating. I don't want to ask the first question because I want to have our students have a chance to ask the first question. So can I turn it over to the students and you can just turn on your mic if you want, or you can ask in the chat. We wait patiently.